So we touched on this a little bit about Libra, and why do you think that these big tech firms moving into the cryptocurrency space, or even Google announced providing checking or accounts now, with Apple having credit cards, why do you think that they are kind of getting so much more heat from the regulators versus something like Bitcoin that's been around for more than a decade now and not being regulated? Why haven't they put a stop to Bitcoin, which has the largest market capitalization of any coin?
Yeah, but it's an easy answer, right? It's simply the volume or the potential volume that they recognize, right? That scares them to death, to be honest.
Plus they can't.
They can't.
They can't block. Sorry?
No owner for Bitcoin.
Yes,
Exactly.
Exactly, they can't.
Who are you calling in front of Congress for Bitcoin?
They always said no market relevance. Right?
Satoshi Nakamoto hasn't answered his emails for many years.
So yeah, who to sue?
I think the concentration of power of these big internet giants has to stop. And of course they're going to try. Why are they doing it? I would do it too if I was working for these organizations. You try to get into the bandwagon because it's about concentrating more power. If you get into payments, whether it's crypto or non-crypto, it's a way of actually locking you in. I think the big potential of the blockchain technology, what it enables in terms of effectively having the trust of the computers, as it were, as opposed to the trust of trusting Mark Zuckerberg or others, is exactly that. Is to stop these monopolies that have actually stifle the internet. The internet is actually a bunch of centralized powers deciding a lot of things. I mean, they're very useful as well. Of course, of course I use Google, and of course I use some of the social media apps. But now we're getting into a new world where the technology, the blockchain technology, enables a decentralization of power. And what we just talked about, access to investment to the wider public, is a decentralization of power, because guess what? Most of investment out there is in private equity, and most of us do not have access to private equity investment because we're not rich enough. It's only 1% of the population that can. So I think that we have an opportunity to change the status quo here and create a new playing field. But why are they doing it? Because it's protection.
One thing I would add, though, there's also the other side of the coin. That blockchain, for example, in China, is actually increasing control over people, right? They're forcing identity to go on the blockchain. They're starting to measure people's behavior and making that more accessible to the government, and starting to control people a little bit more. So there's also the other side of a technology also could be used for not just good, but also as more control. And I think the reaction to Libra, I want to really add a point, is that I think it was such a strong reaction because, if you look at a currency, what makes a currency is the government has control and forces their citizens to use it, and they can devalue it, and they can issue more debt. And if a country's currency is at risk, of course the governments are going to react to that. And I think Libra was a blockchain-based solution that is controlled by a company that threatens governments around the world because they have 2 billion users, all of a sudden that they could get to use it. And I think governments don't want to lose that control and monopoly over their own currencies.
I personally think if Facebook would have made Libra pegged to the dollar, it would have been just another PayPal. And they wouldn't have problems because, hey, they're using the dollar. But the fact that they were actually making it a basket of currencies and they would be able to sell a bit, buy a bit, that made people nervous. And I think the internet gave everybody a voice. Before we had the World Wide Web or the internet, information was like a monopoly. We just had television and radio and newspapers, and that was the news. And the internet gave everybody a voice. Okay, we use it to tweet about useless pop stars, but in other countries they literally started a revolution this way. And it made governments watch the language a bit more. They had, there were cameras everywhere, and we got a smartphone, and before you know it, there's a problem happening on Twitter. Cryptocurrencies, on the other hand, they do the same, but in a way for money, by taking away power of creating money away from the state, whether it's in crypto like Bitcoin, yeah, they would shut it down if they could, but they can't. Or it's Libra, let's kill it before it goes live. They don't want to give up on that power, and they will do everything to enforce it. So this is where the regulations come from, and in a way, it's to prevent terrorism, but it's also eroding our personal privacy, and I think that's really important because without any financial privacy, we don't have any real, it's like a human right in a way. So, yeah, I have very mixed feelings about the regulators and everything.
So I want to add that forbidding movements like Libra could also be a danger for government, because if you think about the telecommunication sector, 20, 30 years ago it was normal that the government is producing telephones. Now this could go fine if you just have a simple telephone. It could be a good idea that the government is producing that. But if you think what we have now, we have different smartphones, millions of apps. It is impossible that the government could produce such a thing. So such a development, what we have seen in the telecommunication sector or for the post sector logistics, could also happen now because of the technology in the area of money. And a government who is forbidding these developments avoids that the industry can develop in his area where it could be taxed, so it will develop another place. And then the chances and the ability to compete of this government would be less than if it had allowed this development in the early stage. So I think the politicians should think well about the risks to forbid movements like Libra or other movements, and not learn how to regulate and to get profit by these new firms, so that they develop on other places. So I think that's a fact. The regulator has not thought so much about nowadays, but I think in 10 or 20 years this will be relevant, what I said. So yeah.
Really, I think within the crypto community, we need to be frank and we need to be honest. We made mistakes, right? So the mistake was to focus so much on the on-chain part of the governance, right? We really analyzed the various tech parts of the whole story, but all of the original projects always tried to hide the off-chain part. So how is actually the decision made about any change in code? And who is deciding about what? And that always created an atmosphere for the regulators and the lawmakers that they cannot really grab this thing. And it was built by intention, right? If we're honest. But that doesn't really work. If we want to achieve mass adoption and the large industry players jumping on it, we need to allow them to build compliance systems, right? So we need to think about the governance from a more holistic perspective, and we must be honest. Let's talk honestly about decentralization and democratization and all these buzzwords. Is this really the case? I'm really convinced if we come up with a governance model that is really fair and inclusive and democratic, then we will get the support by the lawmakers and the regulators, and we will get tax support, by being accepted as non-profit digital infrastructure building. We will get everything. But as long as we try to hide away, we won't make a step forward.
I'm not so sure if this will work. I mean, my main, or I see the biggest risk as government in Libra or some other coins. In Facebook has 2 billion users. Fortnite is 370 million users worldwide. I think that's the 5th largest state, if you would compare it in the world. So it's about losing sovereignty. So there will be new structures of organizations that connect through the internet and sitting somewhere in the world and are united and can develop an economy, a shadow economy on a Fortnite world, just to losing it from Facebook. And I think that's it's the biggest threat for governments because boundaries or borders that do not exist in these structures anymore. And so how can they have an impact on the interest side, negative interest? Why did they get rid of the 500 euro bill in Europe? What do you think? Because it costs more money for a bank to store 10 million euros in their own vault in 200 euros bills than with 500 euros bills. So if they get rid in the next step of fiat money of bills, then they can much more and easy take the interest up and low and have more impact on that than if I store my money under my bed. So this is the important thing from governments. They want to have an impact and don't want to lose sovereignty, and Libra could have been pushed to losing it. And if you look at the oil price, why is the oil price in US dollars? There has been a time where there were discussions with the Bretton Woods system, and the US had their impact on the oil industry and made the connection to the US dollar. So that's where their power is coming from, and this is why they are intervening in Saudi Arabia and wherever they want to, because they want to have that stable system stable. And Libra or other cryptocurrencies are taking the axe and trying to abolish this, and that's a threat.
Talking about governments, I want to comment on a couple of things here. Talking about governments banning things, that only works to a certain point. So, after Zuckerberg had his hearings, he went to see the president, and his argument for pushing Libra was that China is about to do it. So, in the new world order of competition, there's that argument if, we don't do it, then the others are going to do it, or our enemies or whoever else is going to do it. So I think, when you talk about mass adoption, I love this topic, what's needed in order for cryptocurrencies to be mass adopted by the public. There's a lot of talk about, you have digital assets being digital, but you also have currencies or money going digital, right, which is Libra. And then you also have the talks about identity needing to be digital. And when you have the trifecta in a legal and compliant manner being all together, then you'll see mass adoption within the public being able to really use blockchain-based technology to kind of really transfer value in a very quick manner. But I just wanted to make some of those points that we hear in the industry that Libra really pushed the conversation about the regulations and forced the governments and regulators to react to it, which is great. I think it's really great for getting things done. But we still have a lot of roadblocks, towards mass adoption.
Yeah, just quickly adding, I didn't want to speak for Libra, right? Quite the opposite. I think the governance of Libra is actually not good, to be honest, because they built in a lot of conflict of interests in the whole system. So I don't think that this would ever gain the support that I'm dreaming about if we're building proper systems.
If Libra would take off, we'd be happy to include support in our range of ATMs, but I'm not even sure if there is a market for it. But I more think this is part of a larger movement, like we're gradually moving towards like corporate cash. I don't know if that's the right word, but if you look at Amazon.com, I think 1 in every 3 purchases already years ago, maybe 10 years, is made with Amazon points. So Amazon points have a value. It's money you use on Amazon.com. Years ago, I was in San Francisco, and Starbucks just launched this Starbucks prepaid coffee card. I think in one weekend they got like $140 million all of a sudden on their bank account. So that's the weekend they changed from being the coffee brewer from Seattle to being a financial institution. So I think this will happen more and more and more. And Libra or there will be many others after it, and they will be regulated. Technically, I think they're already regulated. In the Netherlands, we have this e-money regulation, so all of Europe, okay, see, that's one thing they agreed on, because most of the new regulations, they're per country. So as an ATM manufacturer, we have to implement 21 different sets of regulations, and that's not really progress, or it's wasted time and money. So.
But we are helping you.
Yes.
Spot9.
Do you want a microphone?
One thing we didn't talk about yet is anonymous versus unanonymous transactions, which I think, when I look at what's, you guys have done at General Bytes with transactions, and, you've kind of started to evolve into helping meet regulations within these countries, right, to ensure that there's KYC that's done, that there are AML rules applied. And so I think that's another thing that I'm really proud of with regards to what spot9 is doing, is we want to bring safe, secure, legal, and compliant crypto assets and currencies to the public. Right? And I think that's another thing that's needed for mass adoption, is to be able to convince the regulators and the public that what they're doing is not illegal, or they're not susceptible to fraud. They're somewhat protected.
Which the other banks don't do. Very few, actually. Even the neobanks out there are forbidden from touching anything which is looking like a crypto or a programmable currency. So I think that's going to help for sure. But I think what's opened Pandora's box anyway is the internet. Nobody would have conceived that something like the internet would actually exist, outside the control of governments. So there's a new power that actually took over the government on the communication on the internet was these big giants. So I think I'll go back to my point. We are going to be able, I believe, to create a governance which is more a people's governance. And I don't think it's necessarily incompatible with regulation. I think that there are certain things the government will always be able to regulate and should be regulating around criminal activities, protecting people's private property and things like that. But for the rest, it's game over for the government from that perspective, because it's already happening. Right? There's an undercurrent of all these stable coins, the DAI, all these things are popping up, right? We don't just see them yet. Libra has put everything above the parapet for a little while, and now we're not going to talk about it so much. But there's still the rest continues. The stable coins go out. There's some exchange being made. Some people use it. Some international trades going on. Some criminal for sure. A lot of it, the majority, not criminal at all. And I don't think it's stoppable. I don't think that is stoppable. I think I'm also an optimist as to the ability to have much more power around the money we want to use, how we want to use it, the data that we want to share. It's all part of the same movement, and I think that it's definitely a movement which is going to take us to a very different world.